Hey, Witch Mob, what's up? Welcome to the Who Is This Crazy Hag podcast. This is episode 6, Baffling Border Games. I usually start by sharing something about myself, but today I want to talk for a minute about what my objective is to read these stories. Honestly, it's not complicated. Basically, the world is on fire, quite literally in some places. And it feels a bit like some dystopian movie plot where we all have cameo roles. My role is to be a distraction. That doesn't mean we shouldn't think about what's happening. It just gives us a breathing space. For 25 to 45 minutes once a week, you can check out of your own reality and listen to a story being read from a book. There's no ulterior motive, just the desire to participate in some helpful way. If all I can do is read to you on your way to work while you weed the roses or cook a meal, and it gives you a minute to breathe, then it's been worth doing. Hang in there and keep breathing. This story comes with trigger warnings. There are mentions of sexual harassment, sexual assault, and violence against women. These things happened to me at the time, and this was not a particularly easy story to tell. However, as a woman traveling alone for much of the time, it was, and still is, the reality of women travelers, and shining a light on the issues of harassment and abuse is important. I appreciate your support. On the subject of support, big hello to Jens in Berlin, Germany. I hope you're enjoying the book. Jeremy in the UK, Helen in Ireland, Fern, Liz and Amy in Australia, Amelia and Harper in New Zealand, and Joe in Mexico. Hola amiga, ¿cómo estás? This story takes us to the Bulgarian border in the late 90s, a few years after the former Eastern Bloc country applied to join the European Union. If your ideal vacation includes lounging in hammocks and reading books, Secret Garden could be the perfect spot for you. From observing iguanas to watching hummingbirds, picking fresh tropical fruit from the garden, and walking to the beach, you can do as little or as much as you like. Secret Garden is an eco-house where you can get away from it all and truly relax. Make your booking on Instagram or Facebook at Secret Garden Mompice. The links are in the show notes. Use the code WITCHPOD for a 20% discount on a 6-day stay. This story takes place in Bulgaria. It's called Baffling Border Games. Before we start this story, I want to tell you about Svilengrad station, one of the most beautiful train stations in Istanbul. We used to go there on a regular basis to attend whirling dervish ceremonies, and this station is one of the most gorgeous places. It's got stained glass everywhere. It's got the most glorious facade, and it used to be the last stop on the Orient Express. It's actually one of the most incredible examples of European Orientalism with a mixture of Art Nouveau and Oriental architecture. Now on to our story. The train pulled out of Svilengrad station in Istanbul just a few minutes late. The haunting whistle echoed throughout slumbering suburbia, carriages clicking and clacking as they trundled past. Hundreds of weary passengers settled in, climbing onto their beds to rest up for the first leg of the long trip to Bucharest. Hi, I'm Carol. I'm Amy. The two women in my compartment introduced themselves and we got chatting, starting with the usual questions. Where are you from? Where are you going? Where have you been? How long have you been travelling? We would be cramped together in the tiny compartment for the next 20 hours or so. The train rattled and rolled through the dark countryside as we lay in our bunks and got to know each other a little. As the humid night grew deeper, we stretched out under the crisp white sheets and slowly drifted off to restless sleep. The train continued to rock us gently through the night. Several hours later, the brakes screeched loudly and the carriages shuddered to a grinding halt. We had stopped at the Turkish border post just outside Erdine. Abruptly, everyone was woken up in the middle of the night by brusque, uniformed men marching through the train, shouting and blowing whistles. "Get up! Get up! This is the border! Wake up!" It was not dissimilar to the first day at boot camp. The line of bleary-eyed and puffy-faced passengers at the immigration office quickly became an impossibly long anaconda-like queue snaking around the otherwise deserted platform. Immigration officials behind glass windows frowned suspiciously at each passport before they stamped and shoved it unceremoniously back through the tiny window, gruffly demanding the next one. Yawning dawdlers were yelled at. Hurry up, we haven't got all night." Soon it was my turn. The official searched for the appropriate entry stamp amongst dozens of others. "How long have you been in Turkey?" he asked in thickly accented English. "Just over 2 years," I answered in Turkish. He reverted to his native tongue. "You have a residency permit?" "No," I replied, smiling, "but I come and go often enough." "Your visa is valid for 90 days, he reminded me sternly. "It expires in 2 days, I said, pointing at the last entry stamp. "Okay," he snorted, nodding agreement, and stamped my passport with a flourish. Eventually, clutching our precious documents, we climbed back onto the waiting train. A short time later, more surly officials came to inspect our passports and make sure we each had the required stamp to leave the country, occasionally eliciting small sums of money from passengers who appeared as if they could easily afford it. Intimidated passengers paid up without protest. Returning to the compartment, I covered myself with a thin blanket and quickly resumed my broken slumber. Within half an hour, everyone had gone back to bed. The train chugged down the track towards Bulgaria, all its passengers once again safely tucked in, many snoring loudly. I slept soundly for what felt like several hours, but was actually only 90 minutes, until the train reached the Bulgarian immigration outpost at Svilengrad. This time, the immigration officials boarded the train with their stamps. There was no need to alight. Sleepily, I gave my passport to the tall uniformed man looming officiously in the narrow doorway. I closed my eyes and waited for the document to be stamped and handed back. It wasn't. The next thing I knew, I was being roughly shaken out of my bunk. 2 uniformed men were yelling at me in Bulgarian. I didn't understand. "What's wrong? What is happening? Do you speak English?" "No," said one man, shaking his head. He gripped my arm tightly and hauled me to the floor. The other man gruffly indicated I should bring my backpack and follow them. I thought they might have wanted to search it for drugs. These days, they never knew who was carrying what. Preparing to endure the indignities of a random search, I followed the 2 men. 2 armed soldiers marched behind me, holding their rifles in the air above my head. The 5 of us walked in formation across the tracks and up an unlit path to a dank office on a platform of the dark and dingy train station. A dozen armed and uniformed soldiers sat idly around the tiny office. Using hand gestures, one of the men I followed ordered me to put down my pack in a corner of the room. "Is there anyone here who speaks English?" I asked, looking around at the grim-faced soldiers. They sat in various poses of disinterest, boredom, and lethargy, reclining on the hard plastic chairs pushed against the yellowing, smoke-stained walls. One man said he spoke a little English. I was heartened for a moment, but that myth was soon dispelled. As it turned out, his heavily accented vocabulary was limited to you, come, go, yes, and no. He didn't know any other words at all. Great! My Bulgarian was a little rusty that day. A tall man emerged from a back room and spoke gruffly to the uniformed men. He looked me up and down with scorn and hatred burning in his eyes, and then started yelling with unexplained fury, pointing wildly at me the whole time. I had no idea what he was angry about. When I refused to be intimidated, he snatched my passport from the desk and threatened to rip it into small pieces. A short, fat man standing nearby rescued my endangered passport from his hands and dropped it into his own shirt pocket. By now I was confused. I didn't know what was happening and becoming increasingly concerned that the train would leave without me. I wanted them to hurry up their search so I could go. We had been standing idly around the office for at least 5 minutes, and no one had looked through my backpack. "Sit," the tall man barked at me, adding one more word to his collective English vocabulary. Choosing the chair nearest the door, I sat and waited. Some phone calls were made. The soldiers whispered to each other, glancing sideways at me from time to time. Most of them just stared and smirked. One of them spat at my feet. Instinctively, I began to feel unsafe. Abruptly, I stood up and began to pace up and down, something I habitually do when stressed. "Does anyone speak English?" I asked again. No one did. Not enough to make any sense of the situation anyway. Eventually, it occurred to me to pose a different question. "What about Turkish? Does anyone speak Turkish?" It seemed one of the men did speak some Turkish. Hearing this was a great relief. What is wrong? Why am I here? Why is everyone so angry? How long will this take? As I asked him more questions, he became confused. "Do you speak Turkish or not?" I asked, frustrated that even simple words were too hard for him to understand. As it turned out, his Turkish wasn't everything it could have been, and it took an inordinate amount of time to make him understand each one of my questions. Eventually, using halting terms that often needed some clever deciphering on my part, he explained that they could stop whomsoever they wanted if they thought it was warranted. "Why did you detain me? There were many people on the train," I asked, wondering why I was alone in this remote Bulgarian outpost in the middle of the night. He laughed scornfully in reply and spoke to his mates in whispered Bulgarian, ignoring me. Their whispering seemed comical. It wasn't as if I could understand them. I wasn't sure what to do, so I settled in to wait and see what would happen. I just want to say that when I say settled in, I was actually shit scared, almost trembling, but I behaved calmly and I didn't move. These men were not aware of how terrified I was of what they might do to me at the time. And so I looked calm, but inside I was absolutely dying of fear. By this time, the northbound train had pulled out of the station without me. I had a sinking feeling of dread. It was going to be a long night. At one point, I wondered if they might put me on the next train that came through. The man who spoke Turkish asked me if I had any money. "There is some in my passport," I replied. His eyes twinkled. Silently cursing myself for being so damned honest, I explained that I counted on having to pay at the border for the visa to enter Romania once I travelled on the train through Bulgaria. After I picked up my Bulgarian transit visa, a good Romanian friend I planned to visit in Bucharest assured me I could get a 30-day visa at the Romanian border without any trouble. There was $100 in small denominations, all new notes, folded inside an envelope tucked into the back of the plastic cover of my passport. The man nodded thoughtfully and put my passport back in his pocket. 1 hour ticked by, and the exact reason for my detention still wasn't made clear. "Why have I been detained?" I asked the man again, hoping he would understand the simple question. "Wait," he said, frowning impatiently. I didn't have to wait long, and then I wished I hadn't asked. A grizzly bear-sized man came through the door a few minutes later and started roaring in his native tongue. I had no clue what he was saying and stood unmoving in the corner near where I had put my backpack. He half turned towards me, waving his huge hammy fist, growling unintelligible sentences that sounded like threats, gesticulating wildly with his other hand. Then he firmly placed his right hand over his genital area, shook it around, and winked at me. Horrified, I looked down at the floor. All the men in the room burst into raucous laughter. I wasn't amused. Once more, I turned to the man who said he knew Turkish. "Why am I here?" I demanded, planting my feet on the floor. "We know that you are a Russian prostitute," he sneered, "and we know that your passport is fake." Laboriously pushing each word off his tongue, he added that they wouldn't allow me to work in their country. I should point out at this point that I was travelling with an Australian passport with a Bulgarian transit visa stamped into it. For whatever reason, they decided that my passport was fake. There's probably a good chance they'd never seen an Australian passport before, but that still does not excuse their behaviour. My jaw could have been scraped off the floor. If it hadn't been so infuriatingly ludicrous and potentially dangerous, I would have laughed out loud. "What?" I spat, now furious. The Romania-bound train I was taken from wasn't scheduled to stop at any cities or train stations on its journey through Bulgaria. It went directly to Bucharest, only stopping briefly at immigration points at the borders on either side of Bulgaria, first in Turkey and then in Romania. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Rationale flew out the window. By now, I was really mad. Incensed at being the unwitting target of this absurd witch hunt, I began raging at the soldiers and officials who had been giggling and snickering at me since I arrived at their office. "You bloody, ignorant imbeciles!" I exploded into a tirade of scathing insults. For the next 5 hours, I was subjected to horrific sexual harassment, threats of a beating, and other physical and verbal abuse. Some of the soldiers tried to grab me. Alarmed and frightened by what might happen, I jumped out of the way. I was physically threatened with police batons and denied both water to drink and the use of the toilet. One uniformed man came and stood near me, at first pretending to be friendly. He then grabbed my breast and squeezed hard. I screamed in pain and terror and punched him in the side of the head. The bear-like head honcho thumped me in the ribs with his big hairy fists for my trouble. I was so distressed at this treatment that I had a mild asthma attack. "Can I walk around outside?" I wheezed, struggling for breath. The bear man told me to shut up and sit down. I couldn't breathe and fought to relax so I could get enough air into my lungs. The smoke in the room didn't help. When I felt my chest tighten up again, I ignored his refusal and marched out the door, desperate for fresh air. 2 men reached out to grab me. Another one yelled as I stomped toward the door. I refused to look around and went out, deftly avoiding the grasp of the soldier nearest the door. I paced up and down the filthy platform for a minute or two while the dozen soldiers sat around smoking and smirking. After some grumbled discussion, 3 soldiers came out of the office and waved their fists in my face. They threatened to beat me if I didn't go back inside. I wanted to scream in terror. Instead, calmly taking the blue inhaler from my pocket, I inhaled deeply 3 times, holding my breath for 30 seconds each time. I could see their little brains ticking over. It was one thing to have some fun on Saturday night in boring old Svilengrad, but it was quite another to allow a foreign woman to get sick or even die. After watching me medicate myself, they huddled for a minute and then seemed convinced it would be a good idea for me to stay outside, at least for a while, as long as I was watched and guarded. Even if I knew in which direction I was supposed to run, I wouldn't get far if I couldn't breathe. The guards needn't have bothered. The armed soldier that was assigned to guard me spent over an hour chasing me around the platform. He continually reached out to touch me and made obscene gestures with his hands. I paced the platform in a wide circle around him, trying to stay in full view of the door of the office. Whenever he thought I was out of sight of the other men, he approached and made lewd suggestions, using his hands to communicate. There was no mistaking his message. As he reached towards my body, I slapped his hands away 6 times. He raised his fists, waving them in my face, cursing, snarling, and spitting at my feet. After a couple of hours of fruitless pursuit, he viciously grabbed my arm, spinning me around, putting me off balance, and tried to kiss me, placing both of his hands on my breasts. "Get away from me!" I screamed with rage and fear and punched him in the face. He took a direct hit on the jawbone. He grabbed my arms and snarled, baring his teeth. Afraid and angry, I started shouting, calling him names that seasoned troopers would have blushed to hear. I pulled one arm free to hit him again and was kicking him in the shins when all the men in the office raced outside to see what was going on. The big man had a thick black police baton in his hand and threatened to bash me with it if I wasn't quiet. The soldier who had attacked me smirked and joined his comrades. The big man stood over me, trying to be intimidating, and thumped the baton into the palm of his hand. "You!" he shouted. "In!" "No!" I shouted back, determined to stand my ground. He tapped me on the shoulder with the thick baton. The weight of the weapon could break a bone if wielded properly. I pushed it off my shoulder and glared back into his florid face. His eyes narrowed, lips tightened, shoulders tense. "In!" he yelled, pointing at the door. "No!" I repeated, in case he didn't understand. He reached out to push me and I stepped backwards. Just for show, I inhaled another dose of Ventolin. Snorting in disgust, the bear man marched away. A few of the men, impressed by my gumption, gently indicated that I should come back inside and sit in the smoky room where they could all see me. "Right," I thought sarcastically, "I'm dying to be your weekend entertainment." I would be their favourite toy for the rest of the night. Digging in my heels, I refused to go inside. Instead, I took a chair from the front of the building and sat in view of the door where they could see me. The soldier who had attacked me disappeared. I didn't see him again. Another tense hour passed. Some of the soldiers nodded off. Exhausted, thirsty, hungry, feeling desperate and helpless, I curled up underneath the chair and tried to get some sleep, dozing fitfully for a few hours with one eye open. The sky turned grey just before the break of dawn. A man came outside and kicked me in the back. I shrieked in pain and shock, leaping out from under the chair. Rubbing my newest bruise, I turned to see who was beating me up. It was one of the soldiers. He yelled and gesticulated to get up. He grabbed my arm and roughly ushered me back into the office. Two men yelled some more in Bulgarian and broken Turkish. The words clashed in the air above my head and fell incoherently to the floor. The bear man waved his thick police baton around my face, threatening to splatter my brains on the platform. I refused to budge, letting the weapon circle my head. I briefly wondered if he would use it again, harder this time. He didn't, but the threat of pain and injury was constant. To his chagrin, he already knew I wasn't easily frightened, and he did his best to scare the hell out of me. What he did more than anything was to make me angry. I dared him to carry out his threat with my eyes. "Out! Go!" he shouted, pointing the stick at the door. He slammed the baton onto the desk with a loud bang. It takes a lot more than a belligerent fat guy in a drab uniform waving a thick stick and yelling threats he would never carry out to frighten me. As the sun crept over the horizon, I was bundled into a car and driven southward to the Turkish border. The man who spoke Turkish came along too, chatting with the young driver. Once we arrived, they parked the car behind a tree out of sight of the Turkish guardhouse. These guys actually hid from the Turkish immigration police because they knew what they had done was illegal and that the Turkish guards wouldn't let them get away with it. "Don't ever come back to Bulgaria," said the man, who still had my passport in his pocket. They had nothing to fear. I would eat needles first. He removed my passport from his pocket and held it up as if it were a prize. With a great flourish, and making a show of his blatant thievery, he removed the envelope of money from inside the back cover. Smiling snidely, he put it in his pocket. He flipped the passport over the back seat. It landed beside me. "Please give that back," I asked, indicating the money in his pocket. I didn't have any other cash on me. It was a long walk to an automatic cash machine. Both men laughed, and one of them said it was the taxi fare. "You'll make it up again in one night," they said, and laughed uproariously at their own sick joke. Then the driver pulled me out of the car, tossed my backpack on the ground, and began to physically push me over the Turkish border. I struggled sideways to grab the bag as I was shoved away from the car. "Go hawk it elsewhere," the other man sniggered at my back. Not bothering to look over my shoulder, I slid my pack onto my back and walked the last few meters to the guardhouse. The sound of their laughter reached me as they drove away. The Turkish police were wonderful. The notoriety of the barbarian Bulgarians was a well-known problem on this particular border. The sergeant in charge immediately took me under his wing. First up, he found me a bus back to Istanbul. I told him I didn't have any cash, that the Bulgarians had stolen it. A moment later, the officer produced a $20 note and put it into my hand. He walked with me to the depot and stayed while I bought the bus ticket, then escorted me to a nearby shop to buy food and water. The friendly policeman waited by my side until the bus was ready to leave and told the driver to look out for me. Apparently, both his daughters were more or less the same age. "Take care of yourself," he said as I got on the bus. When I finally arrived home, stiff and exhausted, I jumped straight into a steaming hot shower to scrub away the clinging scum of degradation and dirtiness of my horrific night in Bulgaria. I soaped my entire body at least 10 times. I took a few days to get myself back together, and gradually, by the middle of the following week, I started to feel like a human being again. In all my years of travelling, I've never been so badly treated by officials in any country. There was no provocation, no valid reason. There are no excuses for mistreating people. It was merely a power game, cat and mouse. It amused them on a slow night. I was disgusted to learn in this way that guards on border patrol in certain countries were free to do whatever they liked to whomever they liked. I had heard stories like mine and worse, but had never experienced it. I'm certainly not the first, nor will I be the last, to be treated like dirt by power-hungry minions on a border crossing. I'll be giving Bulgaria a wide berth for the rest of my life. It's on my blacklist of top 10 places never to travel through. On all subsequent trips to Romania, I travelled from Istanbul by air or sea. Almost a year later, I flew over the hairy armpit of Eastern Europe to see the solar eclipse in Bucharest, certain that I never needed to set foot in Bulgaria again. This story does have a footnote. Several years later, after the Bulgarian government had applied to the European Union for membership, and talks had opened to review their case, Bulgaria changed its policies on visas and border crossings and began to tackle corruption within its police and military forces. In the summer of 2006, I spent a pleasant 2 weeks in Sofia, the capital city, and the town of Plovdiv without any problems.
Hey there, love bugs! Welcome to the jungle! I'm Nancy Miarelli, your guide to the ecological and entomological, i.e. bug, wonders of Ecuador. With my master's in entomology and a passion for ecology and conservation, I'm here to take you on an unforgettable adventure through the mega diverse forests and more lush than you may have expected mountainsides of Ecuador. This year, I'm excited to offer 2 unique science-focused tours. Join me for a nature journaling course where we'll sit in the grass, sketch, observe, and reflect on all the creatures and plants that we discovered. Or dive deep into evolutionary theory on my evolution tour, where you'll see what you learned in a book that one time growing on the side of a tree. Ready to embark on a journey of discovery? Visit www.scibugs.info, that is Scibugs, SCIBUGS, to learn more or find me, Scibugs, everywhere on the internet. Let's explore Ecuador and all it has to offer together.
This was totally a few, and ooh story. Those bastards treated me like I wasn't even human, and that took a toll on my mental health at the time, adding to the pile of trauma I was already dealing with. It made me angry and triggered all kinds of PTSD symptoms. After this, I acted out and I went a little nuts for a while. Luckily for me, there was an amazing therapist in Istanbul who helped me out. And she showed me how to channel that angry energy. One place I've always directed that energy is into the protection of women and children from predators. I grew up in an ignorant society that taught me to defer to men and accept being treated as something less. We were told to put up and shut up. This caused me so much harm that I went off the rails for a really long time. It took decades to get back on track. As a society, even as broken as it all feels right now, we will all benefit from calling out these men who behave disrespectfully, inappropriately, violently towards women. Fighting back is the answer. Join me next week as we head to Azerbaijan for an adventure in Baku. The Who Is This Crazy Hag podcast is created, written, read, produced, edited, mixed and published by Ronnie. If you'd like to grab a copy of Few, Ooh, find the paperback on Amazon or email thewitchpod@gmail.com to get an ebook. Also, let us know via email or on Blue Sky at The Witch Pod if you're reading in a book club or a group of friends so we can give you a shout out. Don't forget to tell us where you are in the world. You can visit The Witch Pod on Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music and Castbox, and also Substack and Patreon. See you next week.